Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Curious Rebel TV. My name is Advita Patel, and I'm the founder of Comms Rebel, the co-founder of A Leader Like Me, and the co-founder of Commerce Rebels. At Comms Rebel, we help organizations cultivate inclusive cultures so your colleagues can thrive. And this week, I am thrilled to be joined by the wonderful Sapna, who we connected on LinkedIn. And you put yourself forward, Sapna, to come and chat about a very important topic, which I know a lot of people care about, which is about class ceilings, not glass, class ceilings. So I want to ask you to introduce yourself, tell people what you do, where you're living, where you're based, and let them get to know you a little bit more as well. So welcome, Sapna.
Thank you. Thanks, Advita. Thanks for inviting me to join today. I'm really excited to be chatting to you this morning. A little bit about me. My name is Sapna. I'm a healthcare communications professional, and I've had a 25-year career in healthcare communications, patient advocacy, data communications, etc. And I was made redundant during the pandemic. And I decided to go and do something that I thought about for quite a long time, which was to try and take up an MBA. Was really interested in learning more about the sort of broader aspects of business, not just my sort of silo. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to go and do that at Cambridge. And I, as part of that, was able to do some original research into class ceilings, which was a subject of interest. And I particularly looked at it within my industry, but I'm sure there's a lot of things that we're going to talk about today that apply in other sectors as well.
Amazing. So for those folks who don't know anything about the class ceiling, it was a term coined, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sapna, by Sam Friedman and Daniel Lawrenson. And they coined it after their research in 2019. And also, from what I understand, published a book around that same title as well. And their study found that in the UK, that even when those from working class backgrounds land prestigious roles and jobs, on average, they earn 16% less than colleagues from privileged backgrounds. Significantly, they also found that this gap persists even when comparing individuals who have the same educational attainment and background, occupational role and level of experience as well, which is just absolutely. I mean, I would like to say the word shocking, but I don't think it actually is. But I just think in 2024, we're still experiencing such the gap in working class backgrounds, even though they have the same degree, the same experience, the same job title. It's just, so like mind blowing for me. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about some of your research that you looked into when you were looking into class ceilings and what you discovered when you were kind of digging a bit deeper in some of this work?
Absolutely, yeah. And the work of Friedman and Lawrenson was the basis for my research. It's a very interesting book, The Class Ceiling. I recommend anyone to take a look at that. It explores lots of aspects. You highlighted there the pay gap. It dives deeper into what does class mean? How are we measuring that? How are we therefore measuring social mobility? And what does it show us? Now, social mobility historically was always measured based on the backgrounds of people entering sort of large groups of working professions or sectors, and which was a useful measure, I think, many years ago. But what has sort of come on since then, and particularly in the class ceiling work, you'll see, same in my work, is it's great, that people have got graduate programs and they're looking at inclusion there and things like that. Now that is the aspect of who gets in. But as you quite rightly say, it's not just simply about who gets in. It's how do they get on and who gets on. So that's what we talk about. When we talk about a class ceiling, we're looking at the development, the progression of individuals, and then and how their background drives that.
And when we spoke offline, not so long ago, actually, we also spoke about the intersectionalities that this can bring, right? So we know that there's a challenge for women to progress in, and that's where the glass ceiling comes in, or even in some cases, concrete ceiling. We know that there's challenge if you're a person of color to kind of progress as well. And then when you bring and disability is the other area that is one of the most marginalized groups when it comes to career progression and getting a role in terms of disability. And when you bring all of that together in terms of intersectionalities, I can imagine it being like a huge challenge for those individuals to even get given a chance. When you were in the kind of organizations that you support and advise and guide, especially from the research you've done in the MBA, what would you say are the kind of barriers or blockers from organizations to like think about this in more detail in terms of not only in terms of like women, not only in terms of people of color, but in terms of every, like the intersections of everyone? What would you say is the barriers that stops them doing that?
Yeah, so I would say every marker of disadvantage, whether that's poverty, socioeconomic class, race, gender, disability, neurodiversity, they all compound each other. So when we say intersectionality, yes, it's important to look at that, but also to remember that one is likely to compound another. So what you see in when we're looking at the socioeconomic class background, those folks are, first of all, probably less likely to go to some of the top universities. They're also less likely to have the networks. Now, network is really important because it's almost a hidden characteristic. So you can't see, for example, my parents' networks.
Nope.
And what influence that might have, how that might guide me into a career, how that moves quickly. That's sort of a hidden aspect of a person, and that very much tends to come, if you come from a working class background, you're less likely to have those influential networks. Okay. In terms of what companies can do to address first of all the barrier to entry into some of, not just professions, but oftentimes we're talking about what are called elite professions. There's a report called Elitist Britain, and you'll see in there the pattern of how those elite professions are predominantly populated by folks from Oxbridge / Russell Group universities, and how that also compounds itself. The privilege compounds and lack of privilege also compounds. All right, so what can companies do? So first of all, you can have a look at your recruitment pool. How narrow is that? Are we putting things like a requirement for a degree on job descriptions when it doesn't really need to be there? So if, for example, if you're recruiting for an entry-level role, does that person need to be a graduate? Are we just excluding people? Are we also, having a very fair assessment of how we're recruiting folks in? So what tends to happen, and you see these patterns, is that people recruit people like them.
Yes.
And you've got another compounding of the situation. So how can you open that up? How can you make that more fair? The types of questions you're asking, the types of references you're giving in an interview, and also that just broadening that pool. So that's really important, first of all. Different ways you can do it. You also see other things like, for example, in PR agencies, you see a lot of London centricity. Yeah. So that's another thing that companies can look at. The second thing is the support and mentoring. So I mentioned the lack of informal mentors, which could be from your network, from your parents' network, from your family network. What can organizations do to make sure that everyone gets the same level of mentoring? And that means, again, we're not just mentoring people that are like us to progress. So how can you make that a fairer process? That's important to look at. And another element that I think is really important is this idea and subjectivity around cultural fit in recruitment. So oftentimes I myself have experienced it where people have said that, oh, well, you know, we'll do an interview and then some people will come out and say, well, I'm not sure if they're the right fit. I'm not sure if they're the right cultural fit. Now, that is a very subjective measure of whether someone's fit to do a job or not.
Yeah.
So looking really in depth at the culture, what kind of culture is being created, how it's being propagated, and how can you address, again, the level of fairness in your recruitment process. But that's about who gets in.
Yeah. And on your point about culture fit, Priya and I went, so Priya Bates is the co-founder of A Leader Like Me, which is our global inclusion consultancy. When we wrote our book, Building Culture of Inclusivity, we spoke about using the word of culture fit because it is a common term that a lot of organizations use. And Priya came across another term at an event in Canada where it was about culture addition. So how is this person adding to the culture and not just fitting in and being the same as everyone else? And that was quite a really interesting conversation that we've had with lots of people, because it's just a term that folks use, but it's the biases that that term can bring. Like, how can we make sure that we recruit the same type of people over and over again? When I speak with agencies and organizations about the talent pool and attracting the right talent, and they say we're just not getting the applications from diverse individuals to be part of this, so we just end up kind of recruiting the same type of individuals. And I'm like, you need to, like, to your point, Sapna, you need to scrutinize your processes like properly and bring in people who can look at those processes alongside you, who are different from you. Because when you're talking to the same type of people, you won't see it, and that's not on you. That's just because your biases won't allow you to see it, because you just can't see the gaps. But when you bring in other voices and people who are from a different background or different experiences, they'll be able to kind of support in terms of where those gaps are. And it's important that we do give people access to the process in the way that they feel aligns with their strengths, right? So when we talk about neurodiversity, you mentioned, you know, lots of folks who are neurodivergent won't find the write a cover letter, fill in all these boxes, and all that doesn't always work for their benefit. So having a slightly different process, which will allow them to shine just as much as it would do with someone who may be neurotypical, is quite important. And again, you're right about the desirable versus, you know, mandatory kind of needs, like degree stuff. Like, we talk about that a lot. And the world has changed since I went to university in terms of, you don't need a degree nowadays unless it's technically needed to do that role, obviously. But is there a different way you can recruit in terms of apprenticeships and in terms of work experience and internships, paid internships, by the way? Because that's another thing that working class or people from a lower socioeconomic background can't afford often to put their hands up for opportunities that are unpaid, which stops them, again, getting the experience that they need to get compared to their peers who may have the privileges of wealth. That they may not do. And our stories are quite similar. You know, when we spoke before about my parents, like your parents, you know, they didn't have like a traditional office job. They worked for themselves, and our networks weren't always available. You know, when I spoke to my friends whose parents worked in offices, they got the work experience at their parents' offices, you know, whereas I couldn't do it that way. We had to do it in, you know, where can we work? And I did work experience in Boots, actually, because it was a shop next door to my mum and dad's shop. So it worked. But I didn't go, you know, we didn't have that opportunity. And I think we just have to be quite mindful about that. So thank you for sharing those tips. Darini is sharing links in the comments for anyone who's interested in the report that Sapna mentioned, which is the Elitist Britain report. And also, we'll also share the link to the class ceiling book that was written, because I think that's I haven't read it, but I'm definitely putting it onto my read list because it sounds like it's a fascinating book to get involved in. In terms of your, you know, we talk about these kind of cultural expectations in the space, right? So accent discrimination is another one. So when I was growing up in Manchester, you know, my mum was very aware that accents can often stop you progressing, you know, because she was, my mum and dad both were ridiculed for having an accent. You know, my dad's from India, mum's from Kenya. So my mum was very keen that my sister and I spoke well. And we didn't use slang or didn't have this. That's why my accent, you can tell I'm from the north, but it doesn't have that strong Mancunian accent. Is this still a problem in the world of work? Would you say that we have evolved, or in your research and stuff, is this kind of accent, dialect, you know, tone? We talk a lot about code switching, don't we, in the workplace?
We do.
Alongside this kind of, you know, class ceiling, how is that in kind of the cultural acceptance with accents? Have you noticed a shift in behaviour over time?
Well, I have to say, I've always worked in London, often in global roles where I'm working with cross-border teams. But I have to say, I've never, you know, really worked with huge numbers of people from other parts of the UK. So what I did do, so I did two things in the research. One was a survey, and then I did quantitative interviews. So I managed to do 6 interviews, in-depth interviews with people who self-selected, and at least 1 or 2 of them, if I remember rightly, had talked about their accent. One was somebody actually who'd come from the US, so that wasn't a regional accent, that was a US accent. And then somebody who was from sort of, I think they were from not sort of far north, but more from the Midlands, Birmingham. And they also talked about some of the, you know, the bias that can come in, or that they've personally felt. That was lived experience. So it's difficult to say across the board, because I personally don't have those measures, but it was definitely expressed to me in interviews. And I think that is kind of a cultural inclusion exclusion point as well, along with lots of other things. When you think immediately, so this person's not like me, you may not think it actively. So if you think about your unconscious biases and how you can take those out of recruitment and progression processes within the company or organization, it's really important, because sometimes people don't know. It's not always intentional, right? So a lot of the exclusion that we've talked about, we can't say it's an intentional process, but it does come in. And I think my sort of conclusion really is, until you really start digging in and measuring, making processes more objective, those biases will continue to live.
Yeah. And that's critical, right? I often talk about a book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yeah.
And he, you know, in his book and the research that he's undertaken, folks are working in the for system 1 brain, which is that, you know, speedy decisions, constantly kind of making quick decisions, because that's otherwise we would be stifled. We wouldn't be able to move if we slowed down our thinking for everything. But we don't really spend a lot of time in our system 2 brain. And these are the terminologies that he's created. They're not scientific terminologies, but the system 2 brain is where we do have to slow down our thinking a little bit. So when we're we have to sense check our assumptions about somebody. And I have to do this as well. And it's not just because I've got several protected characteristics doesn't mean that I am excluded from doing that. You know, we all have biases, all of us. And those who say they don't, it's untrue, because we do. We can't exist without them. But we do have the responsibility to slow down why we made that certain decision about that individual. And why did we make that assumption about them without actually finding out whether it's true or not? And we do that quite a lot. And when you look around you, and I always say to folks that I work with, it's like, look around your table in the workplace. You know, look around the people that you're in your community, at the events that you attend. And are they truly, hand on heart, you need to be quite, you know, be reflective. Are they the same as you? And are you hearing from the same echo chambers continuously? Because if you are, and they sound like you, they look like you, they behave like you, they have the same educational background as you, then it's your responsibility to make that shift and that change. Rather than kind of leaning into this, well, you know, it's just we haven't got the talent out there, or we don't have people applying. And it's almost the messaging you're putting out there. So we talked about accents. So pre-2018, I never spoke at events. I never spoke publicly because I never thought I could or I didn't belong. And the reason for that is because I never saw people like me speaking. Like you said, it was quite London centric. There's people who had been privately educated, often who'd gone to a very prestigious university, who spoke really well and had a thesaurus around them. And I felt like I couldn't articulate in the way I could to be taken seriously. So I just never did. And then when I did a little bit of work around confidence and thought, you know what, if I want people like me to show up, then I need to be the change that I want to see. And I lent into it a little bit more. And since then, things have progressed, right? But you do need to make those conscious efforts. And that's, if you're listening to this and you look around your table or in your community and you don't see difference, then I highly recommend that you pause, reflect, and put proper strategies in place to help. And be very intentional with what that looks like. And Sapna shared some incredible advice and tips about recruitment specifically, and also retainment, right? So once you get them in, what are you doing to build that inclusive network, and how are you making sure? So that mentoring that you mentioned is critical as well. And that takes us to the question from last week's guest, Sapna, which was all about your top tip or tips on creating a policy that best serves the organization and its people. So if somebody's listened to this chat today and they're like, right, we're going to make some progress and we're going to be very intentional with what we do, we're going to say it starts with policies to an extent, but what advice do you have for them? What tips?
So two things actually. So I think the first thing is policies in themselves are great, but they don't achieve anything. That's my personal view, right? So for example, a safeguarding policy doesn't keep people safe. It's the actions of others that will actually make that policy live. So if you're going to have an inclusion policy, or you're going to have a different recruitment policy, that has to be followed up with effective communication plans and strategies to make sure everyone in the organization is living and breathing that, and also checks along the way to measure the progress of that policy. And the implementation is really important. The action is really important. And then the second thing I would say is, what is really important in all the stuff that we've talked about today is tone from the top, right? Yeah. This is evidence-based, documented, the importance of the tone from the top. So if the leaders are creating an environment where everyone feels empowered to act, behave, operate in a particular way, and that also intertwines with psychological safety, etc. But that tone from the leadership does filter down. So I would say, everybody's trying to work to their boss. Everybody wants to look good in the eyes of their boss. So the tone that's coming down is really, really important. What's coming down to middle management and beyond. People need to hear leaders speaking and actively promoting change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And when you are, the communication bit is, I am going to say that we're going to say this, right? It's communication professionals, but it is critical. You can put all these changes in place, but if people don't know about them and don't know how to behave behind them, then what's the point? You're just talking to nobody, really. So having a communications plan and a strategy in how you're going to, first of all, when you put a plan together, it's looking at the kind of RACI. I always add a RACI in plans, because it's important. RACI, for those who don't know, is who's responsible, who is accountable, who are you consulting, and who do you need to keep informed. And that gives accountability for that action, because you can do a list of actions on a plan, but if people are not taking accountability for them, then it's lost. So I always have like a RACI in a plan. I also always have the ADCAR, which is the Prosky change framework, because all of this, what we're speaking about today, is a change. It's a change program, essentially. So you need to be looking at how are we creating awareness? What are we doing to gain desire? So this is the ADCAR framework. What are we doing to make sure that people have the knowledge that they need? How are we building ability in all of this? And then how do we keep reinforcing that message? Because if you're not telling people continuously, they will keep going back to old practices. It's just human behavior. So you have to hold people accountable, but you also need to remind them of the why and what it is that they are expected to do. So having a policy gathering, I was going to say gathering dust, but that's a very 1990s phrase because gathering digital dust maybe is not helpful, and they need to be accessible as well. So that's really important. If you are wondering how do you kind of get that started, you do need a very strong plan behind it. So work very closely with your HR team or whoever is responsible for putting that policy together, and make sure that you've got the right channels in place to do the robust communication behind it. So brilliant. Thank you, Sapna. Before we move on to your question for the next week's guest, I just want to remind folks, and I'm kind of putting on my CIPR hat here a little bit, is that if you are looking for support in terms of how do you get some of this stuff started in terms of policy of those conversations, we have got a load of free resources for members to access, and for non-members, if I think it's a very nominal fee on our online platform. So we'll share the link to that in the chat. If you are a member, then we've got a number of resources created by Sarah Thornhurst and a number of other people who supported her. And those of you who don't know Sarah Thornhurst, she's an incredible advocate for this work and a disability advocate as well in this space. So please do check out those resources, because I think it's really useful to share resources. So there's no excuses, basically. Sapna, what is your question for next week?
Yeah, so I wanted to the first sort of share the first thing that came to my mind actually, which was a lot of people have been asking me about the change that AI is bringing to their business or to their industry. And I think, we're starting to see the impact of AI in communications, sort of left, right, and centre, really. So I'd be interested to know, thoughts on what change they've seen already, if any, or what they're expecting to really impact the industry.
Love that question. Love it. I think it's so important that I know when AI first, and I don't know if you had a similar experience, but when AI first kind of became more mainstream, there was a hell of a lot of eye rolling around it. It was kind of tagged as the remember NFTs, the non-refundable token things that people are buying, those monkeys, which nobody really talks about anymore, and I think they've gone down. I think people put it in that camp initially, but I think you obviously have seen, and I've seen the explosion of artificial intelligence in the mainstream and how people are using it. So I love that question. If people wanted to contact you and stay in touch with you, what's the best way they can do that for you?
So they can contact me on LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest way. It's Sapna Rughani. Just drop me a message and I'll get back to you, and then we can pick that up on email.
Amazing. And you said you're a freelancer, right, Sapna? So you're working with different agencies and organizations to support them around this type of work, but also communication stuff as well. So if anybody does want to get in touch with Sapna, please do so. We're going to share her details in the comments as well. Time has flown by. Honestly, these 30 minutes go so quickly. Before we switch off, is there anything else that you want to leave our viewers with, Sapna? Any final thoughts from you?
So I guess my final thought is, we all need to challenge ourselves when it comes to any type of biases or systemic barriers. So, let's all just take a moment today to challenge our own thinking.
Love it. Thank you so much, Sapna, for your time, energy. And is your MBA dissertation report going to be publicly available?
So it hasn't been published, but I'm just looking into that now to see how can I get it published or into a report so that people can dig into it a little bit more.
Amazing. That will be fantastic. And please do let us know when that is available, because I think that will be an incredible read as well. So thank you once again, everyone, for joining us. If you're watching us live, thank you so much. And if you're watching on replay, welcome. And please do keep on writing the questions if you've got anything from this chat, and we'll make sure that Sapna gets hold of them so she can respond as well. If you do need any support, and if Comms Rebel can help you with inclusive culture work and communication, then please do also drop me a note at hello@commsrebel.com. We'd love to support you and help you as well. And then we'll see you next week for our very I think it's our last one next week for this season, and then we're going to take a break for a few weeks. So please do join us next week, 11:30 on Fridays, and we'll see you then. So take care of yourselves.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.